There's a lot of buzz these days about the vagus nerve. So I thought I'd do a wee video today about what the vagus nerve is, how it works, how exercising it is actually a healthy thing, and how we can actually do that exercise. It's called increasing vagal tone. So I'll share with you a couple of practices at the end of the video for doing that. So let me start with this. We don't just have a vagus nerve. We have about 200,000 vagus nerve fibres, 100,000 or so that run from the top of the brainstem down either side of the neck. Now they innervate the face, they innervate the throat, all of your organs, and they run all throughout the immune system as well. Now, one of the really cool parts of this is 80% of those vagus nerve fibres, 80% of those 200,000 are afferent. And what afferent means is they are gathering information about the internal state of the body and transmitting that information to the brain. The brain then is able to respond via the vagus nerve to maintain an overall state of balance. Let's use a car analogy. The brain might apply the brakes where necessary. It might change gear where necessary, all in the process of maintaining an overall state of balance and harmony, which is known as homeostasis. Now, obviously the vagus nerve therefore plays a really key role in homeostasis. A term used for the fitness, the health and fitness, the efficiency, the activity of the vagus nerve is vagal tone. And I suppose it's a wee bit like muscle tone. You know, you work out a muscle, it gets healthy and fit, and we develop muscle tone. So vagal tone in some ways is a term used that's a wee bit akin to that. It's like the efficiency, the health and the fitness of your vagus nerve, the activity level of your vagus nerve, in one sense, in maintaining this overall level of health and balance. Studies show that the higher your vagal tone, the more overall healthy you tend to be. For example, high vagal tone is associated with better mental health, with better cardiovascular health, with slower pulse, slower heart rate, so the same thing, slower respiration, better control of inflammation, and a host of other different healthy benefits. Now, one of the cool things about vagus nerve and vagal tone is you can increase vagal tone, and one of the ways to do that is by using deep breathing. Now, you've probably noticed that when you exhale, that your pulse, that your heartbeat, your pulse rate slows down. Now, the reason for that is the vagus nerve is applying the brakes. Your vagus nerve is actually called the primary brake on heart rate. In other words, it's like when you breathe out, it's like a brake on a car. There's a vagal brake that slows down your heart rate. Now, this is how it works. This is kind of cool. This will help you to understand better why breathing techniques are actually very useful for improving vagal tone. When you inhale and your lungs inflate, the cells in your lungs obviously expand because your lungs are inflating, so the cells stretch. There are receptors called pulmonary stretch receptors on these cells that detect the stretch, and they send a signal through the vagus nerve up to the brain. When the brain gets that signal, it communicates with the heart, and what it does here is it eases off the vagal brake. And if it's easing off the vagal brake, what that means, like in a car, if you ease off the brake, the car speeds up. So in other words, your heart rate increases. And this is why when you inhale, your heart rate increases. When you exhale, on the other hand, the signal coming from the brain to the heart is to apply the vagal brake. And if you're applying the brake, what happens in a car? The car slows down. Same thing in the heart. When you apply the vagal brake, the heart rate slows down. And so when you breathe in, your heart rate increases. When you breathe out, your heart rate decreases. The difference between your heart rate increasing and decreasing is known as HRV, or heart rate variability, which is an approximate indicator of, therefore, vagal tone, because it's the vagus nerve that's applying the brake. And this is why HRV is sometimes used as an approximate indicator of a person's vagal tone. And this is also why breathing techniques, deep breathing techniques, in particular diaphragmatic techniques, can increase vagal tone, because the key to increasing vagal tone here is to increase the amount of activation going from the brain to the heart via the vagus nerve. In other words, increase the vagal brake. And the way to do that is to prolong the out-breath. So in other words, a longer out-breath maintains the vagal brake for longer. In other words, is maintaining vagus nerve activation to the heart for longer, and therefore with that greater activity level, it's like working out more at the gym, and you gradually through practice increase vagal tone. In fact, that's what studies actually show, is this type of breathing technique does actually cause in time, with a bit of practice, an increase in vagal tone. Now, one of the really cool aspects of the vagus nerve is that it also controls inflammation. It plays a major role in controlling inflammation in the body through something called the inflammatory reflex. And this was discovered by Kevin Tracy a number of years back. And the way this works is the vagus nerve senses, remember I said that 80% of the vagus nerve fibers are afferent, in other words, sending information about the internal state of the body up to the brain, so that the brain can then make a decision about what to do to maintain balance. Well, some of that information is about the level of inflammation in the body. So if the brain thinks there's too much inflammation, then some stimulation comes, activation comes from the brain throughout the body, through the vagus nerve, that causes a reduction in inflammation that actually works. If you want to be a bit more technical, the vagus nerve communicates with a wee gene called that produces a substance, a cytokine known as TNF alpha, tumor necrosis factor alpha, and it basically down-regulates, it turns down the levels of that inflammatory substance, which left to its own devices can set off a wee storm of cytokines. You've probably heard the term a cytokine storm before. So TNF plays a big role in initiating all that. So if we can turn it off, then it can slow down a lot of the inflammation, and that's exactly what the inflammatory reflex does, is it turns down the levels of TNF alpha. And so just to summarise the inflammatory reflex part, the vagus nerve is sensing the state of inflammation in the body. That information is coming to the brain. The brain is then saying, if there's too much, communicate through the vagus nerve to the immune system to turn down inflammation. The way it does that is by turning down this TNF alpha, and that causes a reduction in inflammation. Now, this is the reason I want to go into a wee bit more detail here on that particular part of the inflammatory reflex, is because there's exciting new research into what's called vagus nerve stimulation, or VNS, which is when you electrically stimulate the vagus nerve. The way they typically do it in research is to implant a sensor into the neck where the vagus nerve fibers are, and particularly stimulate the vagus nerve to cause a substantial reduction in inflammation. It's been shown in clinical trials to substantially reduce inflammation and pain in patients with rheumatoid arthritis, and therefore lead to a much improved quality of life. It's also been shown to help people with Crohn's, epilepsy, even for depression. So there's a lot of excitement about the vagus nerve. As I say, the reason why I talked about the inflammation bit is because there's a growing amount of research in biomedical engineering, which is creating these vagus nerve stimulation devices for the purpose of reducing inflammation via the inflammatory reflex. But putting that aside, how do we increase vagal tone? Well, there's a number of different ways to do it, but one of the key ways to do it is by breath, by breathing. In particular, making the exhale longer than the inhale. One simple practice, let me share one simple practice, the 3-7 breath. And this is actually a go-to practice of Kevin Tracy, who discovered the inflammatory reflex. He wrote a fantastic book called The Great Nerve, which is all about the vagus nerve, how it works. One of his go-to practices is the 3-7 breath, where you take an inhale for a count of 3, and then you exhale for a count of 7. Inhale for 3, exhale for 7. The reason for the 3-7, it makes the breath 10 seconds, and it means that you're breathing 6 times in a minute, which in other pieces of research has been shown to be quite a healthy thing. Some people do a 4-8 breath, I don't think it matters all that much as long as the out-breath is prolonged a bit more than the in-breath to increase vagus nerve activation. And try that for 5 minutes. Another one to try for 5 minutes, studies found this improved people's overall sense of well-being. It was cyclic sighing. In other words, you take a breath in, and on the out-breath, you sigh. Take a breath in. And you're just audibly sighing. And a study found that just 5 minutes of cyclic sighing, they call it cyclic sighing because you're just continually doing it, for about 5 minutes a day was immensely beneficial for people. So there you go.